describing it using the language of elections. It's really fits and proper.
So in that argument, the implausibility is a central part of the message. It's the fact that it's hard to swallow is part of what's going on.
Yeah, you're all meant to bend the knee and say you received 10% of the votes and you couldn't just by doing that, you're part of the class. And therefore you're also part of the dog.
Yeah. Andrei Kurkov, do you think Russian people believe it at any level, or is Peter right? They recognise it as a show of power?
I don't think they believe, but I think they are so frightened that even they don't question this, and they try not to think about this. And for them, this is the message that there will be no change in Russian policies, including the war against Ukraine.
And do the numbers matter at all, or it's just they just have to be huge enough to be?
Well, I think that they should be between 85 and 99.9
for the absence of doubt.
Yeah.
Charlotte G, I mean, we're talking to you about tech and things. I mean, the interesting thing here is all of this can be done with 19th century technology, can't it? I mean, it's just, you don't need any of it. You only need the high technology for real elections where there might be a marginal seat or a shade in the vote might make a difference.
Yes, well, you needed to persuade, which wasn't necessary in this situation.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got power.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, let's turn to your book, Andrei, The Silver Bone. You set the novel in 1919 in Kiev, possibly in an even more turbulent time in its history than even now. Can you tell us about the city then? What was happening?
Well, actually, after October Revolution in Russia and collapse of Russian Empire, Russia had a real civil war between the Bolsheviks and the White Army. And many people don't realize that in Ukraine there were two wars for the price of one. There was war for Ukrainian independence with the 2.5 Ukrainian armies involved. There was Polish army, and there were, of course, Bolsheviks and the White Army. So, I mean, it was a chaos, very violent chaos. And in fact, actually, the situation was very similar to what happened in February 22. In fact, actually, Kyiv was attacked from the same northeast direction by Putin's army as it was attacked by the Russian army, Red Army of General Muravyev. And with the same violence, actually, Kyiv was taken over. Well, I'm very happy that it was not taken over this time, but these periods are very similar to me, because then Russia tried hard to occupy all of Ukraine and turn it into the Soviet Republic, and they succeeded after 4 years of the war. And now it's the same goal that is announced by Putin.
It's a very turbulent period. I mean, the characters literally don't know when they go out in the morning who is in charge. Somebody says, it changes like the English weather. You have to kind of check who's running your particular area of Kyiv before you venture into the streets. It's the first of a trilogy, this book. What was the inspiration for it? What was the original inspiration?
What happened that in 2017, when I finished to write the novel The Grey Bees, I got a phone call from one lady, and she said she has a present for me. And she asked me for the address, and then she delivered me by car a box of original files of VCK, of Bolshevik Secret Police, dealing with the cases of 1919 through to 1921.
How had she come by these documents?
She is a daughter of a KGB officer who actually kept these documents at home, and he obviously wanted to use them himself because there are his notes on the margins of the documents. Lots of documents are handwritten. And I was fascinated especially by the papers written by people who were detained, and they had to explain why they are not guilty and what they were doing on that day. So, I mean, the daily routine described in these papers was incredible. And
so it's a treasure trove for a novelist.
Yes.
You've got details of daily life, what they're doing, what they're eating.
And it was actually more important for me than the cases, because I mean, many cases were made up, they were fake. They were just to get rid of people from other classes.
Was the Soviet state unusually bureaucratic? I mean, it's interesting, your hero, Samson, he gets a job in the police because he's got a good prose style. And almost every page he's sort of told to sit down and write it out. I mean, that was a feature of that time, is it?
Well, because, I mean, the Soviet power, which came for the second time to Kiev and controlled it for several months in 1919. I mean, they couldn't find qualified functionaries. I mean, the soldiers were illiterate. The first functionaries were half literate. So, I mean, everybody who was not considered a class enemy and he was educated or she was educated, they were trying to use it.
But it's interesting. I mean, that thing of being a class enemy, he's hovering at all times on this edge of whether he'll write the wrong thing or say the wrong thing, or indeed possess the wrong kind of possession.
Yeah.
The book, the writing of it preceded the war. I mean, we're reading it in England now, long after the war, and it sort of seems to chime and fit with events that have happened since. You wrote it before the war. Would you have written it any differently, do you think, if you'd come to it later?
Well, in fact, for me, the war started in 2014 with annexation of Crimea and the war of Donbass. Yeah. So, I mean, I was writing in the middle of the war, but the war was sort of abandoned by the West and ignored by many Ukrainians who were living far away from the front lines. But, I mean, my thoughts were all occupied by this war, and it was obvious that actually the frozen front lines will not be frozen forever. And Putin was very unhappy with the situation in Crimea, which was not accepted by the world as Russian territory. It was boycotted by the companies, and even Russian banks were afraid to open offices on the Crimean territory because of this international boycott.
But you must have read things in those documents that chimed with what we then saw in Russia. I mean, you've got two Red Army soldiers. They're looting. They're stealing things.
Well, what was happening and is happening on occupied territories, that happened in Bucha near Kiev when actually Russian army tried to attack Kiev, and they were stealing washing machines from the houses of Ukrainian peasants, transporting them to Belarus and sending from there to their houses as trophies. So it was the same, and I don't think there is much difference between Red Army of 1919 and Russian army of today.
The book has a very vivid sense of Kiev now. I mean, literally street by street, you know where the characters are and what they're doing. It's very detailed in historical terms, but it has this one fantastical element. Your detective's ear is sliced off right at the beginning of the book and seems to have a life, continuing life, that helps him out. Why that fantastical detail?
Well, I mean, I have also in my other novels medical fantasies, probably because my mother was a doctor and my grandmother was a military surgeon and a doctor, and I grew up in a house with a huge medical library. But also, I think it is in Ukrainian tradition, humor, black humor, and if you think about the nose of Gogol,
which has a life in its own.
So I think subconsciously, probably, I was sort of following Gogol's way.
It's a very useful thing for a detective to have, an ear that can be in a different room.
Yes.
And survey things. But here, Samson says at one point, I mean, I thought of that famous Raymond Chandler quote, down these mean streets a man must go. A man who is not himself mean, who is neither tarnished nor afraid. He is an innocent, and he is a moral character. He is afraid quite a lot of the time. He says this at one point: honesty is the best means of maintaining self-control and self-respect. Is it not sometimes a liability too, honesty? I mean, we're talking about truth and honesty.
Oh, of course, lots of people are punished for being honest or killed for being honest. So I mean, it's a question of dignity, it's a question of survival. So, I mean, for people for whom the honesty is more important than anything else, I mean, they risk much more in any society than those who adopt to the situation and accept happily the results of Putin's elections.
Yeah, that dignity is very important to Samson in the book, isn't it? To give him some sort of compass of what he's going to do in this chaotic situation. You've gone back to Putin. We hear a lot about Russian disinformation and Russian disinformation about Ukraine. What are Ukrainians in Ukraine learning about the war now? Do they get a relatively independent account of what's happening on the front line, advances, reverses?
Yes. And if they want to have more information, they can get it. In fact, actually, we have some independent soldiers, journalists, who are reporting very often the stories which are sort of hidden or not reported by the official sources. I mean, you have Yuri Butusov, a journalist who is obviously not very much liked by the president's administration, and who is fighting, and who was reporting from Bakhmut during the fighting for Bakhmut. And also, I mean, the Telegram channels, there are sort of channels which are under control or sort of friendly to Zelensky's administration, and there are channels which are definitely independent, and they don't ask anybody permission to report the information they obtain, they get, and they can prove that this is a real information.
Yes, I mean, I think Telegram, to a certain degree, Peter Pomerantsev, is a porous element of kind of Russian control of information, isn't it, as well?
Well, more porous than maybe some Soviet things, but still sort of skillfully controlled in some ways. So yeah, I mean, so far we've had this sort of flowering of Russian Z bloggers, as they're known, who are these kind of very militaristic, sometimes even critical of the army chiefs. Sort of, that's sort of the position they take. But they're being squashed, and they were useful to the Kremlin. It was sort of an allowed open space. They were useful because the Kremlin wanted somebody to criticize the army chiefs so they wouldn't get too big for their boots.
They're interesting because they're rather similar to the character you write about in your book. I mean, or the fictional character that is created by Sefton Delmer, Der Chef, who is notionally a kind of Prussian soldier, a Hitler loyalist, but furious at the conduct of the war. Before we get on to Der Chef, can you just tell us about Sefton Delmer? Because he's basically who your book is about. Who was he, and why was he perfectly placed to become an anti-German propagandist?
So Sefton Delmer grew up in Berlin. He was born in Berlin, the son of a British Australian academic. So he grew up bilingual. He then went to, when he was 13, went back to Britain, then went back to Germany in his 20s, became really a superstar reporter, reporting on the rise of the Nazis, managed to become sort of an insider, writing about Hitler very close up, and writing about the rise of Nazi propaganda.
I mean, he threw parties for senior officials, didn't he? And
yeah, I mean, according to him, he kind of seduced them, essentially. He even bought a piano for Hitler's press attaché to play. And he disguised himself as the deputy of the stormtroopers to smuggle his way into a stormtrooper rally. And he was the only foreign correspondent who got access to Hitler's infamous election flights in the late 1920s, flying from one hysterical rally to the next, and seeing close up as Hitler transformed from this sort of, what he described as a tired traveling salesman to this sort of inspired, pure, godlike figure.
So he knew German and he knew the Nazis, but he'd also seen Nazi propaganda at work.
Yeah, he was with Hitler during these infamous rallies, when Hitler really sort of made his propaganda name, flying around the country, and he sort of got to see both the power and the vulnerability of the propaganda, which is when the war starts, sort of wants to put those skills to good use. He feels British propaganda, or British communication, because he's talking about the German service of the BBC. Sorry, maybe that's but that's the word he would have used, frankly. He was disappointed what the German service of the BBC were doing during that period.
Why was he disappointed? He thought it was sort of too polite, too idealistic.
He thought it was too idealistic. He thought it was preaching to the converted. He thought the German service of the BBC was what we might call today stuck in its own echo chamber. It was.
He says, like Maida Vale calling to Hampstead at one point.
Yeah, he meant it was like one set of liberal German emigres to another one. It was full of wordy speeches about democratic values, and that wouldn't do anything to undermine the hold that the Nazis had over ordinary Germans, which is what he wanted to change.
He quoted Hitler that there is an inner Schweinhund in every German. So what did he create to appeal to that inner Schweinhund? What did he mean by that, and what did he make to appeal to it?
Yeah, I mean, like he said Bellman was always provocative, basically saying instead of appealing to people's sort of high democratic values in order to undermine the Nazis, you've actually got to appear to appeal to their self-interest, their greed, their envy, and all this sort of rich bouquet of emotions. But actually, it's been, incredibly clever, I think. Firstly, was breaking the Nazis' monopoly on strong emotion. So the shows that he made, which included a sort of a patriotic, hyper-militaristic German, were full of invective, very colourful fury, porn, and these incredibly colourful rants about real corruption among Nazi officials. So that was the first thing he did, is sort of really break the Nazis' monopoly on strong feelings, which was not what the BBC was doing.
And was there evidence of how many people were listening to it?
So we have several data points around this. The British were doing surveys of young POWs. By the end of the war, around 40% of POWs were saying they listened to Delner's shows. You get many, many stations. That's pretty amazing. Imagine 40% of Russian soldiers now were listening to something, a media that we or Ukrainian allies produce. Then there's the kind of you have a correspondence of the Nazi elites, the head of the SS in Munich saying Delmer stations are among the top 3 most popular in Munich in 1943. So again, I mean that's like being one of the top 3 cable stations in Texas, where I am right now, along CNN and MSNBC and Delmer media.
And those listeners, were they listening and thinking we are listening to British propaganda, but we're enjoying it because it's got these scabrous stories and kind of corny gossip in it? Or did they think, actually, this might really be like a Zen blogger, a real person?
So there was a journey that Delmer went on. So he did many, many things over the war, and he started off wanting to see people. He wanted people to think that these were genuine patriotic stations. But he gets busted. A bit like now, if you do a sort of like this sort of soft puppet media, as they're known, on social media, you're going to get busted pretty quick, and he gets busted within 6 or 7 months. And then he basically comes up with something which I found so fascinating. I decided to write a book about it. He wants Germans to understand that this is the British cosplaying Nazis. And what he's doing is providing people with cover. Cover, firstly, in a very simple sense, that if the Gestapo catch you, go, well, sir, I thought this was a genuine pro-Nazi station.
I mean, we should remember you could be executed for listening to British
You could be hung, people were. It was punctual behavior. But more interested in that, because that's kind of a basic idea of cover, it was a form of psychological cover. He basically decided, and lots of people who work with him confirmed this, what they've worked out is that people need to play this sort of consensual self-deception. It's much easier for people to be disloyal to their own country if the language that you use uses our boys, our guys, us, rather than them or you, the way the BBC were. And even more so, cover in the sense that people needed a high-minded excuse to do what they really wanted to do, which was surrender, defect, disobey the Nazis. So when it was presented under the guise of patriotism, people found it easier to then do something which at the end of the day was being disloyal to authorities, to the countries.
And how important was truth in that?
It idea of why and how.
How important was truth? Because that channel that he set up, it was called Soldatensender, reported honestly on Allied reversals, didn't it? That if the Allies lost a battle, you would hear about it. Which is clearly sort of seeding a sense that this is reliable.
Yeah, and not just that. So Delmer, what he was doing was creating a masquerade under which he could reintroduce truth into the empire of Nazi guys. So the most amount of his effort was spent on research. He needed to understand the lives of the soldier and the citizen, and it's really quite remarkable what they did. Interviews with POWs, putting microphones in POW camps to find out all the latest jokes and rumours and stories that German soldiers told each other, opening the letters of Nazi officials when they corresponded with their families abroad, partisan groups across Europe, French partisans, give Delma the latest sort of stories about which mid-ranking official was corrupt, what the which VD the prostitutes in Calais was suffering from and giving people, what were the latest diseases that soldiers were suffering from in whatever lazarette.
So I mean, it's the interesting. I mean, it's local news, isn't it, that always gets people in trouble because people know their own area. So if you hear local news and you think, "Yep, I've been past that brothel,"
totally.
You get it. He obviously enjoyed this. I mean, so he also retaliated in clear, didn't he, September? He did broadcasts responding to the broadcasts of a German called Fritcher. And he did sort of instant rebuttals, didn't he, at some points?
That is what he did on the German service at the BBC. So he had this double life. He was doing this covert work over at Woburn Abbey in Bedfordshire. There was vast team of astrologists and psychiatrists, spies, and novelists working with him. And then he would pop down to the BBC once a week. And yes, he would do these instant rebuttals. So the German superstar of German radio would give some propagandistic talk, and he replied instantly on the BBC, rebutting it and satirising it, often and provoking it. It was like
we have a little clip of him actually, a recording of him, and he's responding to Fritcher and saying, "You've forgotten something, Fritcher, in your last report." I think he's turned this round within 2
sorry,
hours.
I worked last night and I didn't tell you anything. Today by 1 o'clock I will finish and I can be at your home. By 1 o'clock. Is that the crowd noise? Yeah, because I'm moving as well. I'm on A1 going to Bedford. This is the problem. Yeah, so by 1 o'clock I can come. I think I will finish by that time. And I will come to help you. Yes, I'm going directly to you because Sanju told me that. Yeah, I'm very sorry. I worked last night, so I didn't let you yesterday know that I'm going to work. So yeah, it was quite late in the afternoon. And by 1 o'clock, yeah, I will call you to see if it's alright. Yes, I will call you. It's alright. Thank you very much. I'm going to Bedford to a depot. No, not inside the town. Yes, to do work there. For a depot. So, yes, I'm going. No. Still working, yes, still working. It's alright, yeah? Okay, very good.
And at a very fundamental level, propaganda creates an ersatz community for people confused and deracinated by rapid social change. He wasn't just talking about the Nazis, he was also talking about the switch from rural communities to urban communities. And Jacques Ellul, who was a sociologist that you referred to, comes to the same conclusion. Propaganda is what, gives people a sense of us when they're particularly atomized and alienated. I mean, most recently during COVID, we saw the crazy burst of things like the QAnon conspiracy theory here in the US, which, during this time when people were just like completely discombobulated, living alone, you have this growth of online conspiracy theories to give people a sense of us. That doesn't excuse evil propaganda. You know, many people go through this and don't end up believing in sadistic and cruel forms of propaganda. But it is this underlying kind of moment and rupture which makes a lot of things possible.
Charlotte G., that is a characteristic of modern propaganda and conspiracy theories, isn't it? That even if the means they use are things that are terrible and frightening and fearful, ultimately it must make people feel better in some way, that they are part of a community.
Yes, and of course, because of the way we live now, it's incredibly atomised, and we are lonelier. We're getting lonelier and lonelier, and we also don't have those small checks and balances. You know, if you were popping into the office every day and you came up with a conspiracy theory, perhaps one of your colleagues could say, it's crazy. Yeah, and that's a lot harder to do if everyone's sat there. So technology is kind of both the remedy and also making it much worse.
Does it resonate with you, Emily Kirchhoff, that idea of propaganda as a solution to loneliness?
Not really. Not really. And I'm thinking about counter-propaganda. Is it a positive thing or not? Because, I mean, sometimes actually counter-propaganda is copying the propaganda and becoming propaganda.
Well, this is takes us back to the Stafford Cripps point, is that if you go low, as Sefton Delmer did, haven't you essentially capitulated already? You know, if you're just creating more false facts. Peter, I don't know what you think about that.
So Cripps' actually the problem wasn't with false facts. Let's be very clear here. So Sir Stafford Cripps was a very, very Puritan and very Christian official in Churchill's government who was appalled by the use of pornography in Delmer's programs. But he was eventually convinced that pornography was a good thing because, unlike the BBC, this got viewers in, or listeners, to be more precise. But it broke taboos. It much run since 1941, so it was a way of saying the unsayable. This pornography involved Nazi officials doing all sorts of lewd and spectacularly lewd things. But it was also a way to talk about corruption within Nazi elites. Because, you know, the pornography showed them to be decadent, and the pornography showed them using, I don't know, things like butter in their various orgies, while butter was rationed.
That was the really shocking thing, they had butter.
Yeah, it was a scene with a butter and helmet, a bunch of sailors that Stafford Cripps was really alarmed about.
Yeah. Andrei Kirchhoff, are Ukrainians sort of comically aware of Russian propaganda in the war? Is it something that is kind of ridiculed within the country?
Intellectuals, yes.
Yeah.
The ordinary Ukrainians are just appalled by this propaganda, but they actually very often share the samples of propaganda on the social media, and it gets very strange sort of reactions because it starts bothering people.
Oh, I see. So it does get through. It works at that level. It unsettles them. Peter, before we move on, towards the end of your book, you say, I mean, you're talking about our current predicament in terms of fake news and the proliferation of fake news. And you say what we need to do is give people the motivation to care about the truth again. Don't people already think of themselves as motivated to care about the truth? I mean, that's exactly what QAnon uses. They call themselves truthers. That idea that you are getting access to a truth that nobody else has access to is the big driving engine of conspiracy, isn't it?
It's very interesting when you look at the kind of extremes of skepticism where conspiracy becomes appealing. And there's been sort of various studies about this that, you know, you think that if you're skeptical of everything, you don't believe anything around you, you would end up in this place where you're sort of free and independent. But you don't. The paradox is when you don't believe anything, you end up in a world where conspiracies start to appeal. The appeal of conspiracy theories is very related to a lack of a sense of agency. When you think you can't do anything, you can't change anything, conspiracy theories sort of explain that lack of a sense of agency away, sort of excuse it through a dark web of reasons that you can't quite fathom. It's sort of the opposite of love.
Charlotte,
it's the opposite of.
This is absolutely your
Well,
territory.
the funny thing is, and you know, I'm actually thinking of the Kate Middleton photo editing scandal. And the more they've been stalking, I'm just thinking there are so many uncanny parallels, which, to be clear, didn't, it seems, actually involve AI at all. But, you know, when people don't have, because there is a very clear suspicion that we are not being told the truth. And of course, people rush in with their theories for you know, what's really going on, what's really happened. So it's that kind of poisoning, and that is something that AI is contributing, that sort of poisoning the well of what is real and what isn't real. Can we believe anything anymore?
Well, it's very interesting how AI in particular has undermined that. I mean, they use a very, very recent kind of internet phrase, pictures or it didn't happen, has already been made redundant by AI, hasn't it? Because pictures don't mean anything anymore. They're not proof of anything. In fact, they're usually taken as proof of something going on.
Yes, exactly. And we have no way of telling whether something is made by AI or not. I mean, there are little telltale signs, and AI used to be really bad at making hands, for example. It's actually now becoming fairly good at that. And so, you know, it's becoming almost impossible to tell what is real and what isn't. And all the solutions that Silicon Valley is trying to propose, you know, watermarks, they're also not particularly great and have lots of flaws themselves.
There's a sort of catch-22 here, isn't there? Because it is our degree of suspicion that is training AI to get better. We're pretty good at looking at hands or cat's paws, I understand.
Yes,
They're also
paws,
very,
yes.
AI is very bad at. So we instantly see that, they instantly correct it.
Yes,
it only takes 2 months for them
Yes.
to get round to
You
it.
could say it's a cat and mouse game. Yeah, absolutely. No, completely. It's a constant sort of a battle for people that are trying to break the way that it works, and then the companies that are trying to build it so that it's stronger and better and better. So right now there is no incentive for any of this to slow down, because all the companies are competing because they want to be the one to come up with the killer AI app. And so there's really no brakes on it. Politicians don't even understand it, let alone, you know, regulate it. So we are in quite a scary world right now.
It's interesting. I was reading Peter's book and thinking about AI. He wouldn't have needed to have a rebuttal or to create a fake thing. He could have broadcast in Goebbels' voice if he had the current technology.
Yes.
He could have broadcast, you know, in Fritsch's voice into Germany. How much of that is actually happening? What is the most prevalent use of deepfakery? Is it in political misdirection?
Well, no. Most deepfakes are used to shame women. Most deepfakes are revenge porn used to put women in situations that they weren't actually in. For example, the Taylor Swift deepfakes. So by and large, actually, it's used to sort of punish women rather than.
It's a rather lowering thread in our conversation, isn't it? We keep coming back to porn.
Yes, I know. I'm afraid so. I'm sorry about that. But that is the reality, and that is how tech generally is adopted for porn first.
Okay, and then what else is happening? What else are people doing with it? You had a rather interesting experiment where they're using AI to create avatars after death.
Yes. Well, I used AI to turn my mum and dad into voice bots. They are both still alive, thankfully. But just as an experiment to see if it's possible to sort of pull apart a bit and put them back together through technology. And it is becoming. I mean, we're not. It wouldn't pass the bar for, oh yeah, that's definitely a real conversation with mum or with dad. But we are actually reaching the point where it's sort of, if you just squint a bit and turn your head to one side, it almost does seem real. So in terms of voice cloning, which you referred to, that is that's incredibly accurate now. And you look at the Biden robocall, for example, and I think in Slovakia there were some faked audio recordings that helped to potentially sway the outcome of the election recently. So who knows what will happen with the elections this year? But we can expect to see more and more and more of this.
The intriguing thing, Peter Pomerantsev, is that we are highly vigilant about messages that we don't want to listen to. And we don't check the ones that we agree with. I mean, you can see that happening on social media, can't you? That people very often will get furious about fakery in one aspect and then casually share something that is obviously fake in another.
Yeah, I mean, there's two. I mean, I suppose you could look at propaganda in two ways: the supply side, which is pumping out all this content, and the demand side. And I suppose I'm just as interested in the demand side as the supply side, and that's what Delma was thinking of at all. Why are people motivated to embrace some messages and not others? And yes, you're quite right. I mean, people will be very, very studious and fact-checky and media literate when it's stuff they don't like, and when it's stuff they like, they're like, oh, they just swallow it. So understanding those dynamics is really, I think, the secret.
This has happened in Ukraine, hasn't it? There have been fakes of Zelensky, fake pictures of Zelensky in various ways used.
Yes, but what is more interesting than there are obvious AI photos, photoshops, and pro-Ukrainian propaganda on social networks, and people are still sharing it, saying that probably it is a fake, but I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, AI for fun. I mean, some people are also using it just to have a laugh, which you can't necessarily legislate against.
I mean, obviously, it is potentially worrying. There was a very interesting video of Javier Milei, the Argentinian president, fluently speaking English, because an AI translator had not only translated in real time what he was saying, but then manipulated the image so that his lips moved in time with the English words. You can just about tell, but in a year's time, probably we won't be able to.
Yeah.
So what steps are being taken to kind of, put barriers around this?
Well, I mean, these different companies, Microsoft, OpenAI, Google, they're saying, well, we're going to work together to put these guardrails in, and we're going to create watermarks, and we're going to make sure that there are ways that you can tell something's AI generated. But it's all voluntary. There's no real sticking sort of binding deadlines or really sort of any way to force